Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones, the unvisited ones, the cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show artist, maker, and teacher Daniel Mack. Daniel joins us today to talk about a book he, in fact, did not write, which is The Mirror of Magic by Kurt Seligmann. But he is the chairman of the Seligmann Center Committee, and we are unfortunately a few decades late to speak to the Surrealist painter and independent historian of magic, Kurt himself. So we talk art, Surrealism, magic, a little bit of farming, irrationality, as well as the remarkable Seligmann himself. Good stuff. Let's do it. Daniel, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, it's nice to be with you.
Yeah, wonderful. So we have a traditional first question for first-time guests on the show, and in this case, I'm going to amend it slightly. So the traditional first question, amended slightly, Daniel, is: was Kurt Seligmann a weird kid?
No, I think he was probably a pretty normal child. Art-oriented, loved his family. His father was not so interested in him becoming an artist. That wasn't really a way to make a living. There was a family business. But it's a really good question, Gordon, because where I want to go throughout this discussion is how certain themes that you run into in your life or you're born with seem to persist. And that was really the way with Seligmann. There's a picture we have of him as probably a 6-year-old dressed in a clown costume with a hoop. And he may well have been been in one of the carnivals in Basel. But there was a consistency in his interests in kind of masquerade, costuming, heraldry, and that began as a child. And I think it was very appropriate for a Swiss boy at that time.
Well, yeah, he grew up with a fairly sort of middle to upper middle class early 20th century life, didn't he? His father owned a furniture department store, and so they weren't living on the breadline, as it were, at the time. And were his interests, looking at the rest of his life, was there anyone in his family that had the same interest in what would become art and surrealism and magic and so on as he moves through his career? I'm not a total expert on his biography. He did take art lessons as a young boy, and a couple of those people, and the heraldry, the pageantry of the carnival, I think, was very formative for him. Gotcha. And also, he did a picture very, very young of a Roman soldier, kind of a profile of a young soldier, and that kind of imagery, that and some other heraldic images seem to reappear often in pieces or in whole in a lot of his paintings and engravings. We'll probably come on to this later in the discussion, but the Surrealists sort of moved their, I guess, theory of mind from Freud to Jung in terms of major emphasis over the course of, peak Surrealism. Did he, are you aware if he did any sort of subsequent analysis of his childhood to see if he found any of these motifs? I mean, did he land on the pageantry and the heraldry and that kind of carnival stuff himself? Yeah, good question. We have so much of his writing too. Yeah, he was very careful. I mean,
kept all his letters, notebooks, correspondence, and I have not been through it all. A couple of the scholars involved, one of the people that wrote the preface, Sabina Grazina Sublet from the Guggenheim Museum, she very diligently went through all the material at Yale, which is about 30 file boxes of things, and we have about 3 or 4 that in our possession. So she read all that, and I don't remember in conversation with her if she could answer that question.
Yeah, so I've in preparation for our discussion, I watched some of the videos associated with the 2015 Weinstein Gallery exhibition and so on, which will be in the show notes for people listening. And it didn't seem to come up there as well. I think that,
Right.
I think people, and it seems like a really good observation that sense of, I don't want to say diaspora, but that sense of exile was a recurring motif that I do think he was aware of. But I was just wondering if he kind of ever did, even what Jung did when he wrote Memories, Dreams, Reflections, to sort of sit down and go, well, where did all of this stuff come from in my childhood?
Yeah, even the later writings that I'm familiar with, he kind of honored the mystery of it all rather than kind of delving into it. And I think many artists kind of want to protect the kind of miasma around their work and not subject it to too much analysis for fear of losing some of the edge.
Well, that's very surrealist of him, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, he does mention he does mention Jung once in the book. I remember seeing, but that's all. And he mentions Freud a couple times, but he was definitely aware of Jung and that whole progression of psychoanalytic thought into myth, which of course is what he was very interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he certainly had quite the library. I'm not surprised if that there wouldn't have been some Jungian works or in there, or at least crossed his desk. How did he? I mean, was he always a reader? Let's stay with the childhood, and also tell us, because I think it's fascinating, and I'm extremely jealous. How did he end up with such a library?
Let me back up a little bit. His whole life was punctuated with those 2 wars. So just in prepping for talking with you, I was sort of thinking of the larger fabric behind the screens behind our lives that we do our work in front of. And so as a young man, he was born in 1900, so World War I was when he was from 13 through 17, very formative time. And then World War II, you could smell it happening. And then he actually wrote this book during the war in the United States. So I think that the wars were very formative for him, and a lot of the work he was doing was kind of, how do I react to what's going on? How can I either control it or understand it? And I think if we look at his work and his life as kind of bookended by wars, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. And he I don't want to say he predicted or envisioned the war, but during his time in Paris, he was sort of aware that it's probably going to happen again, wasn't it?
Yes, I think everyone. Yeah, sure. You could feel it in the air, I think.
Well, let's take that biography then. So, born in Basel, when he went to study, did he go to Florence first? When he went abroad to study specifically, because I know that was where he first encountered Kabbalah in the Christian Renaissance sense.
Yeah, he was in Florence. I think he was in Florence till 1920, when he had to come back to run the furniture store. So he first started in Florence, that's right. He was in a rather formal school, formal art education school, and he wanted something a little less formal than that, and he switched. And that's where he met Hans Arp and Giacometti.
And would we say then, I mean, we're not too sure, as you say, there is the influence or the being impacted by heraldry and that kind of stuff as a kid. But would we officially date his interest in what would become, the esoteric and surrealism from the encounter with the Renaissance Neoplatonists and Hermeticists and things that he would have been looking at and or studying in Florence?
No, I think I would, just from what I do know, I would say it happened before that. I would say that it was very formative. The Basel of his childhood was a very rich and traditional place, and I think a lot of his work, right on through to the end, was a way to repackage, re-experience, revisit the mysterious energy of what Basel was like then.
Ah, fascinating. Yeah, cool. And so did he, after he returned to run the store because his father was poorly, was it after that he went to Paris?
Yeah, then he did that for, was it either 6 or 8 years? Quite a long time. Oh, it was, 8 yeyears. So as a young man, he was 20 to 28. Imagine deferring, to family at that point and just saying, and he did no artwork from anything we can find. And it was just the dutiful son running the family business. And then finally it just popped, and he resigned and went to Paris. And
how quickly did he fall in with the Surrealists and Breton and all that at the time? Was it more or less instantly, or did they encounter him because he started painting again, or were they just sort of hanging out in the same cafes?
I think certainly he met. That's where he met. I'm sorry, I was wrong earlier. That's where he met Arp and Max Ernst through Arp, and Arp became a kind of a mentor of his. And I don't exactly. Not sure when he met Breton.
But was it in Paris or was it in New York?
Oh, it was definitely in Paris.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And then he helped Breton, of course, and so many of the others flee France through Marseille and come to New York.
Yeah, quite a few. He's like the surrealist Oskar Schindler. Just doing the research for it. The Claude Lévi-Strauss, André Breton. This list of people he helped is amazing.
It is, and I'm not sure how much of it was conscious or unconscious, that he just happened to come at the right time. And then he also tied up here in the Hudson Valley. There was, what was his name? There was a key American character that helped set up the Emergency Relief Committee. And they were we have letters between Seligmann and him. The name will come back to me. He was politically very active. That dedication to his family business showed another side to him, the dutiful son, the filial side, the wars. So what I'm trying to kind of sketch out here, Gordon, is kind of the very elaborate tapestry against which he did his art. And he was unlike some other artists. Other artists, I think, have a stronger core sense of themselves as artists, and that their artwork is paramount. He had a kind of a balance, it seemed to me, in his life between family, general cultural issues, the war. He became very interested in ethnography, his lifelong interest in magic and the occult, and we'll get to the reasons for that in a minute. So it was a very interesting. So I'm seeing him as a very multifaceted character, which among my artistic friends is not always the case. Usually, some characteristics are much more prominent and dominant than others.
And do you think he gets sufficient credit for that? I mean, you're right. He's very much he's in the world in a way that the classic trope of the artist or writer in a garret, secluding him or herself away, isn't there. I mean, you mentioned he I don't know how someone does this. I'm so impressed. But in 1938, sort of taking yourself off to do like amateur anthropology amongst the First Nations of the Pacific Northwest, like that's remarkable.
It is so that he had the interest, and two, the opportunity to follow his own interests. So he was lacking a certain kind of blind ambition, I think, that drove a lot of other artists at the time, Salvador Dali, for instance, or even Picasso, who were titans in their world and made themselves and capitalized on themselves. The other thing is, when he married very well. His wife, Arlette, was of the Wildenstein family, and it was a very wealthy family, so that I don't think money was much of an issue for him.
Well, that'll do it. But there's a spiritual combined with intellectual interest or curiosity that leads someone to do that, because I think of it, particularly given the books and the artwork he would subsequently create. So he's out there in the Pacific Northwest exploring and listening to the relation between legend and image and place and form, and being in that. He's sort of, the Surrealists were interested in, we used sort of outdated terms like, primitive art or whatever, but they were very interested in totems and totemism and that kind of thing. And it just seems like the most remarkable. You see an intellectual interest that is wider than, as you say, the ambition to be the world's greatest artist or something. That's right. Yeah. So they all kind of wove together. So the idea of the tapestry, I think, is an important image for how we're discussing Kurt Seligmann. Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we get to the US part, let's talk about, and I'll give you a challenging question, Daniel. Let's talk about the Surrealists and being in Paris. How do you define Surrealism? I would see it as kind of a snappy reaction to to the depression coming out of World War I. Oh God, what are we going to do? And that idea of embracing and exalting the unconscious or the irrational or the silly or the playful or the accidental was almost a survival mechanism for some people who were, saw that they were sandwiched in between two wars. And so it is particularly interested in the emerging theories of mind of the early 20th century. There's the sort of transition from Freud to Jung, and as you say, the use of the irrational and the focus of or the interest in dreams and kind of like non-waking thought modes, isn't it? Yes, that there's more to the world than the rational and the logical. Yeah, because the rational and the logical, look where it's gotten us. So it was very determined exploration of that's what magic would be. Magic, it would be the world of kind of unnameable forces. You feel the force, but you can't quite identify its edges, or you certainly can't control it. So that it's recognizing that there are forces that are somewhat unknowable. And I was watching a video in prep for our discussion where you managed to tie surrealism to both social media and alchemy, and I think correctly suggests that it might be time for surrealism to put itself back in the spotlight somewhat. Do you want to kind of pull on that for us? I think it has its own life. That's why I thought we would get to that a bit later. I mean, just what happened with Banksy in the last couple of days, I thought was wonderful. That idea of surprise and the things happening outside expectation. Are you still there? Listening. Listening intently.
Your pictures seem to go away here. Oh, there you are. So yeah, I was expecting we'd get to that a little bit later, but I'm happy to talk about that now because these things have their own ways, and that's what I think Seligmann. That's why I don't think he went through quite a few bumps in his life. The wars were one. The kind of deferring of his career back to his family was another. And then, in 1943, he had the gall to challenge André Breton's discussion and interpretation of a tarot card, and it happened to be the Fool. And Breton there and then kind of kicked him out of the Surrealist group publicly. And it was very humiliating. And Breton returned all Seligmann's work that he owned to him, and he was banished. He was never in a show again that Breton put together. He was in many, many shows, but so he had that kind of affront. Peggy Guggenheim did something quite similar to him. She had wanted a painting that he owned, and he and his wife discussed it, and they said, "No, we won't give it to you." And she said, "Well, you will never. I will return all your work, and you will never show in one of my galleries again." And sure enough, that happened to him. So he suffered a bit, but he had such a wide range of interests that he could kind of pick himself back up and move along.
Do you know the details? Because I was going to ask about that. The details of the argument over the Fool. I mean, what was Breton's position versus Seligmann's over the sort of?
I don't know. Perhaps if you talk with one of the academics who was involved with this, they maybe have those details.
Yeah, because
I love that it was the Fool.
Oh, it's perfect. Especially as you say, there's that picture of him as a jester, as a child. So you kind of have a archetypal double beginnings there, because it's sort of the book, which we will talk about, is has two key origin pieces as far as I can tell and as far as I've researched. There's the war, as you say, and grappling with the two wars, and this is where I think surrealism comes in and has there's a call for it today, given that we're all kind of, not just in the United States, but if you're looking at how politics is going in the West in general, it's like, well, what is the response we have? What can we do, and how do we think with this? And I think surrealism has a lot to offer in that sense. But the other one was essentially being ostracized by Breton, so the book has this kind of. There are two things: there's grappling with the world, and also reformulating his identity as something, I guess, beyond an artist, because it's remarkable that he's this guy who's run a furniture store and done ethnography and is an immensely talented artist. And then he's like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do a game-changing history of Western magic. That's just astounding.
Yeah, but you can see, I mean, I'm looking at the pressures today that, here in America or everywhere. I don't think you can even be a world citizen without sort of shaking your head over our president. And what Seligmann did in kind of viewing World War I and World War II and that kind of the turmoil that was almost part of the air at the time. And we have our own today. We have the environment. A book has just come out saying it's too late. There's nothing we can do to save the planet. And then we have, between Russia and the United States, a couple of very kind of unhinged characters, very theatrical characters. I think Seligmann's reaction in his time was to take kind of a telescopic view of that. And that's where the Mirror of Magic, I do think, came from. He was looking back and doing research as far as he could to say, this can't be the only time this has happened in the world. This can't be the only time that this level of war has taken over, this level of distress and suffering. And similarly, you can see the parallels I'm drawing today. So let's go back. Let's keep studying ways and times when people reacted and see how it happened. And those are almost the outline of the Mirror of Magic. Go back to Egypt, go back to the Sumerians, go back to Gnosticism, and just look as dispassionately as we can about the way they dealt with distress at the time. And so I think he was looking to create a pile of evidence that we've done this before as humans, and there are ways through this. So it was a very optimistic and kind of addressing the despair of the time. And
just very well timed in its re-release as in this remarkable format. I think. Yeah. So we have. On the show, we get astrologers quite a bit, and there's a regular one, a friend of mine, Austin Kopic, and we often talk about what can happen when you view your present challenges on a sufficiently long timeline, which is it may not suggest a solution, but it certainly provides hope, because you can say, yes, we have in fact been through this before. Like, this isn't the worst of all worlds and the worst of all times. Even if it's pretty bad, there is inspiration that can be drawn from context and a kind of understanding of the wider movements of history. And I think for Seligmann, and it's not, so what was he started writing this when he was in his 40s, didn't he? It was 47, 48 it came out.
Yeah, he started writing it during World War II, but he had been collecting. He'd been a bibliophile for years and years. I mean, he brought some of it with him from Europe, and then had a very active correspondence with book dealers, antique book dealers, throughout the 30s and 40s. So it was a passion of his, and I see that's why I started out early. That he had this. He was touched early in life by the kind of ancient history of Europe, and he wanted to. He bathed in that. He reveled in that. And I think this collection of books was another way to kind of bulwark that.
Yeah, you can see, and I, quite frankly, I appreciate this. My background has been in publishing before I moved to this little farm. And I remember once, a few years ago, I was at Hay-on-Wye in the sort of Welsh borders in Britain. And it's sort of like the secondhand book capital of the world, right? Because this tiny village has 71 or whatever it is now, secondhand bookstores. And I'm wandering store to store. And I ended up filling the car with a whole bunch of books in like a refugee sense, because I looked at what will fill the shelves in say 8 years' time is the stuff that is being sold now, and it's all sporting biographies and celebrity recipe books and that kind of mid-list weird book. And funnily enough, Mirror of Magic would have been an example of it. I bought things like Morning of the Magicians and that kind of thing, because I'm like, well, I understand the impulse that comes from looking at what has happened to the world and maybe where culture is heading and the sort of things you can do even if it's not conscious. And I'm a bit of an occult historiography nerd, and it was fascinating doing a read through of the latest copy and kind of knowing exactly in my head which texts he'd got from England and which of the blue grimoires he'd read from 19th century Paris, and it's really, really interesting. And because I know a bit about how academia has grappled with quote-unquote Western magic in the second half of the 20th century. There are some bits about Sumer and Egypt that are certainly a mid-20th century view that's maybe changed, but a lot of the stuff held up. And it's essentially a self-taught occult historian. And the analysis of it, it's not just a catalogue and a presentation of the information. He's seeing the currents. And it's so surrealist. Like he's actually seeing the currents and the thought patterns. It's almost what's the word I'm looking for here? It's almost Foucauldian, because it's almost like it's an history of ideas, but it's more than that. It's just the most astounding thing to read, and it's so well written for someone who didn't speak English as a first language.
I was struck by that too. I was rereading parts of it. Your use of the word self-taught is really important. In terms of just the feel of the book, so often, and I have a modest library of books on alchemy, but often you're being sold a theory in some way, and that's part of the academic tradition today. That people are weaving things for you to be amazed at. He basically laid out various streams of information, and then there was that deep breath that was taken. You could almost feel it chapter by chapter. So what do you think about that? That he allowed you to participate in the processing of the information. He wasn't digesting it for you.
For me, it's most evident in the witchcraft chapter, because I know quite a bit about the witch trials and the sort of emergence of witch laws from Rome going through Christian Europe and into the New World, and also the second half of the 20th century's analysis of the witch trials. And he opens it with some really creepy accounts of sort of historic demon possession in convents and so on, that aren't well known outside of the Francosphere, but obviously he was in the Francosphere. And so he opens with really odd stuff that I have a lot of people who are work in the paranormal world, and there's a lot of research around, how are possessions related to more modern phenomena like UFO encounters and so on. And he opens with that, and then he goes through his analysis, and it's just the most well-structured way of presenting the information, because he's sort of like, well, here are some accounts, and here is my interpretation of them. And it's this extremely sophisticated understanding of how we understand witches and witchcraft and possession and the Sabbaths. And the thing is, academia got worse at that analysis after him before it got better in maybe the last 15 years. And the betterness of it is in fact coming closer to what Seligman managed to write himself just from his own reading. It's sort of, it refuses to close the door on there being a reality to these phenomena, whereas we sort of have that 70s to 90s period where and this is certainly true, but it's insufficiently true, where it became a materialist, feminist, unidirectional power interpretation, where it's about men's impacts on women's bodies. And it is certainly that, but if you only describe it that way, you miss the other side of that power thing, which is some of these women were actually witches, and the reason they were witches is part of that power dialectic, and some of these things are true, and like in the sense of these are real experiences that people went through. And he lands on that in the 40s, and we had to take 30 years off to kind of do a probably necessary but not very good analysis of the witch trials, and now we're in a better place having done it. But where we are now looks like what Seligman wrote in Mirror of Magic. It's amazing.
Yeah. See, this kind of sure-footedness that you're describing was, I guess, the way he protected himself from kind of the bumps of the politics of the art world. You know, that, oh, sure, let me get kicked out of the Surrealist group, or let Peggy Guggenheim sort of banish me. So he had these other, he seemed very self-assured with what he was saying, you know, because he was basing it in the history of the books that he had been collecting very carefully.
Yeah.
You know, that whole library has gone to Cornell. Cornell bought it just after he died. I think they went to his wife in 96, 92, I think. No, that was actually quite a ways after. I guess I don't have the date, but they were there. It's the crown jewel in their collection right now.
I'm sure it is. Is it accessible to researchers? Like, is there like the Seligman Library at Cornell?
Yeah, there is. I don't know. We worked with them a few years ago. The librarian, Laurent Ferry, and then one of the curators, they did a show up there celebrating Seligman, and I worked with them, but I didn't, I don't know if you could actually get in and see the books.
Yeah, fair enough. So speaking of Mirror of Magic, we've sort of discussed what it was a response to in the macro world, and an attempt to kind of think about the wars and stuff that's going on in his life. And it is ostensibly an historical survey of the history of Western magic, but it's more than both of those things. So, Daniel, in your estimation, what is the sort of thesis of the book?
It's really quite simple. That I think very early on, Seligman embraced that idea that all is one, and that you just have to begin to find those connections. So the basic premises of alchemy, that the unity of spirit and matter, and that if you are patient enough, diligent enough, careful enough, or just playful and silly enough, you can experience these things, and you can begin to amass evidence for this kind of worldview.
So do you think he was doing magic the way listeners to a show like this would understand it, with the sort of layman's and paper crown and circle on the floor? Do you think he did any of that stuff, or how did he understand or see magic? Because I think this ties into what you just said and the thesis of the book. Yeah.
There are pictures of him doing magic, and but it seemed to me more parlor games than anything, because, it was New York City. It was a very sophisticated group of people who, I think, many of whom were much more interested in their careers selling work than they were dedicated to the more arcane aspects of magic, which to me is done privately, indirectly, and not directly. So that I think that there were some theatrics. There's a picture, a very famous picture of him standing in a magic circle that he's drawn, clearly the center of attention, and with a lot of kind of famous people of the 40s and 50s around him. So I personally don't think that he was. I think he was a relatively introspective, recessive character. He was not anywhere near as kind of extroverted as other artists. So I think magic was more of a kind of a parlor game for him. And it's probably not the most honorific way to put it. He believed in magic, but I'm not sure if he saw himself. He definitely considered himself a magus. He was a magician, but I think it was on a much deeper level and much less public than that, where you're creating environments for people, and for him it was painting, which was liquid emotion for him, that somehow would be the scrim, would be the veil through which information, nonverbal, powerful magic information would come. I don't think that was necessarily done with pentacles and candles on the floor.
No, I think he recognized structurally what as you say, he was operating at a deeper level, because there's a quotation in one of the intro pieces to the book where he says, "Paint is water and stone, and it is also liquid thought." So that's someone who understands alchemy, because paint is these two things, water and stone, and its arrangement and its interaction with the alchemist or the painter means it is liquid thought. This guy doesn't need the circles on the ground, put it that way.
Right. So it made for very good photographs.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the conclusion alone is kind of worth it. That's one of the better pieces of writing that you'll read in the 20th century about magic. I mean, I have this sort of, when he says, his update almost of As Above, So Below, as far as I can tell, is where he says, all is contained in all. Now, in many ways, that's an improvement on As Above, So Below. And it, in fact, prefigures how holograms work. It's sort of saying the same thing better, because the way a hologram works is that the entirety of it is contained within each individual piece, or otherwise they don't work. And that's kind of one of the reasons the holographic universe theory is so interesting to esotericists. But he kind of got that prior to there being actual holograms. He's sort of, all is contained in all is a more sophisticated way of saying As Above, So Below, I think, when I read it.
It reminds me that that other essay that introduces the book, Celia Rabinovich's essay, where she explores more his Jewish background and Jewish mysticism. I think of that reference in the Kabbalah to, that joy was broken up at one point and everybody has a piece of it. So that's the sort of the way I take all is all, that we all have pieces of kind of the magic or the reality. And you can look for that kind of spark of joy in anyone and everyone you meet. Yeah. And that's where I think he became a teacher too. I've talked to some of the people who he actually taught. Several years ago, when I first started working at the Seligmann Center or volunteering there, I said, there must be people around. And I began, going through student lists and just word of mouth. And I found a number of people around the world who had studied with Seligmann at Brooklyn College and learned art. And they talked to the person about what a kind, gentlemanly, kind of evocative character he was. And that is someone who I think has a kind of a Kabbalistic understanding of that everybody carries with them that spark of soul.
Yeah, it's also, as you say, dealing with the ups and downs of the art world over what was quite a long career. It does keep you on a more even keel to be able to go, okay.
Yes.
Andre has kicked me out, but there's a spark of divine in him too, I guess. Like there's it's almost, it's a nice way of seeing the world so you don't fly into a furious rage or a depressive funk.
Yeah, he didn't start until he started early on at Briarcliff College. That might have been in the late 40s. But his major teaching was at Brooklyn College for almost 9 years, and that was in the 50s. So he was 50 years old when he started. So there was a lot of work. He was basically a painter during the 30s and 40s. And then he began teaching slightly later in life.
And that's after the book came out as well.
It is after the book. That's right. Yeah.
So, I mean, you mentioned the Institute. Tell us about the farm and why the Seligmans picked Sugarloaf.
I'm not quite sure. There's different theories, and I was able to speak with the man who found Seligman the morning he accidentally shot himself. I visited with him quite a bit, wondering whether given the topic of suicide among surrealists. You just have to wonder, Case Sage committed suicide. I mean, suicide was a very active topic. And when someone says there was an accidental shooting, you just wondered. And this man absolutely swore, no, we were on our way to get a car fixed. There was no way. I have anecdotal information about that place. I've been over there. It's a beautiful 50-acre piece of property, rolling hills. Still a little farmhouse, several outbuildings. That one contains his old etching press still. We have maybe 150 of his etchings, and he was as much an engraver as he was a painter. And then we keep getting, at this point in time, we keep getting people sending us back things, people who had, families that had collected his work. All of a sudden, it doesn't mean anything to the next generation or 2 generations away. And they say, what can we do with this? And either it goes to Sotheby's, or sometimes we'll just inherit a pile of 50 etchings from a dealer who's going out of business or something. The buildings were all, when his wife Arlette finally died in 1996 or 92, the estate was given to a local organization here, and all the work went to Sotheby's, and it was a $4 million auction, and major work. $2 million of it went to restore the place, which was pretty tumble down at that point. She lived as kind of a real kind of almost bag lady for the last period of her life, with goats in the house. I mean, it was really quite eccentric. So the place was restored, and there was $2 million in a trust at this point, which spins off about $120,000 a year to help maintain the place, which is not really quite enough because the buildings are old and it needs more upkeep than that. So the land is bounded by a small hamlet, a hamlet of craftsmen, and it's a very kind of funky little kind of Woodstock-like place, Woodstock of the 1950s almost. It's never gotten out of that. The tarot readers and potters and candle makers. I mean, it's almost like you've walked back into kind of the 1960s in a certain way. That's Sugarloaf, New York.
Wonderful.
And it was sort of like that when the Seligmans were there. It was known as the Village of Craftsmen. So the buildings are in good enough shape that we've had meetings, we have exhibits. There's a very nice, his studio has been turned back into quite a lovely exhibit area. It's a little tall. I mean, for showing work intimately, it's a little difficult. But then we have his etching press house is a smaller place, and we can show more intimate work in that. And it's sort of, we live in a very rural county. Seligman, I don't think, was understood at all in this county. Although at one point, and this just gets to the point that he was very eclectic. He was a man for all seasons. He was a member of the Ag Bureau in Orange County. He was practicing permaculture techniques in the 1950s. So it was his interests were very, very eclectic. And there's a picture of him standing, with other farmers, talking about the quality of the land and what they're growing on it. So we still have a lot of very beautiful land here, and we're about to put up, taking 10 of the 50 acres and putting up a solar farm, which we have discussions. What would Kurt say? I mean, that's what we have T-shirts that say, "What would Kurt do? What would Kurt say?"
Love it.
And wondering what his response to a solar farm would be.
Well, he's a wider sense alchemist. So if you were transmuting light, I think he'd be into it.
Oh, good. You're helping me, because I was on the other end of it. I was on kind of the preservationist end, like, don't touch that land, So
no, well, I can see that, the preservationist side of it, but I think he'd probably be interested in it, as you say. I think in the video that will be below the show, it's a discussion Martika Sowen has as a result of the Weinstein 2015 Weinstein Gallery 2015 exhibition. She mentions that both of them actually quite enjoyed the sort of gardening, homesteading component. Do you think that was sort of part of his, how to describe this? Was that part of his idea that the whole universe is kind of magic and he's thus more than an artist because he's doing all this kind of stuff? Did it have the same philosophical implications for him, you think?
Yeah, I think it actually goes back to another Swiss. So we'll talk about the book a little bit. The book is very eclectic. It's kind of more of an encyclopedia than anything. So it has these chapters on different cultures, different time periods, and how spirit and matter were approached. Beliefs, follies, and then it has another section of kind of profiles of people that Seligmann seemed to admire. And one was, of course, the Swiss Dr. Paracelsus, who's, let me see, I actually took some quotes out of that one. And he talked about, here it is, nature is the highest authority. The body is the house for the spirit. So I think that Seligmann embraced that idea of the importance of nature overall, or nature as the background for this. So I think that him having that farm and holding on to it from 1942 to when he died in 62, and then she was a rabid farmer. Flowers, animals. I mean, they were both very committed to the earth, and I think it was part of that philosophy that he brought with him right from youth.
Mm. So when he was teaching in Brooklyn, was he making the 50-mile each way trip to work, or did he live back in New York at the time?
I don't really know that. I thought of that as I was preparing for this. I mean, I've gotten a little travel averse going to New York myself, and that idea of traveling, I don't know what his schedule is like at Brooklyn College. They kept the apartment on 42nd Street in the Beaux-Arts building ever since they got to New York, and then they only let that go in about 1960, I think.
Right, so he could have done the classic having a city bolt hole kind of thing, because it's probably, well, we may assume less horrible than it is catching trains now from a crowd and upkeep perspective. So it's doable, that's for sure. I certainly had London friends who would do longer trips than that daily coming into town for work. But I was wondering that myself. Did he? I mean, they obviously enjoyed living up there. They lived up there for decades. So I'm just wondering, and I guess I would think about it from my perspective, because I've just moved on to a little place at the beginning of the year. And you think, I don't know, if the whole point of living somewhere like a farm in upstate New York is to not have to do the daily grind.
So I think, if my premise that money was not an issue is true, then he didn't really have to do the teaching.
Yeah.
That there was enough money in the family, and certainly his collection of art. I mean, even in 1996, $4 million to have Picassos and Ernsts, and I mean, it's common among artists to sort of gift each other with your pieces. That it just didn't seem like he had to teach because it was a necessity.
Mm. That's fascinating. I think I'm just wondering, Daniel, have you ever read Upstate Cauldron by Jocelyn Godwin?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, it's. I was thinking about that book as I'm reading through Mirror of Magic, because Jocelyn's book, he wrote about the general oddness of upstate New York and the Hudson Valley, particularly in the 19th century, and the fact that it birthed all these esoteric movements like spiritualism and Christian Science, and even up to the 1980s, it has Whitley Strieber's UFO accounts and so on. And so the thesis of the book is that there is something specific about this little corner of the world that is not just eclectic in the Woodstock sense that you mentioned, but like weird with a capital W. And just as I'm reading through the sort of story of Seligmann's life, I'm like, there's probably only one place in the US he could have lived, which was in this area, that same little corner of the world that we get things like, early versions of a kind of American Hermeticism and even Christian Science and spiritualism and whatever from, admittedly, 100 years before he got there, but nevertheless, he's sort of co-locating with all these unusual New World spiritual modes. And I think there's something useful in thinking with landscape when it comes to trying to get underneath different artists and writers and so on.
That's a very interesting thought, Gordon.
Yeah. I recommend the book.
In this area, one of Gurdjieff's students set up one of their centers here in the mid 60s. Dr. Nyland moved up from New York City to this area, and there's still. I mean, it was a kind of religious epiphany for the area with the quality of all these people moving in and just that religious energy they brought with them.
And are you from the area, or did you move for this amazing job?
I moved I was in New York for 18 years, and then I moved up here in about 1988.
And not going back?
No, I go back. No, I don't think so.
No, I think it's a good place you've got living. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, it's lovely. I write a column for a local magazine called Dirt, and the column is called Thin Places. And that may ring a bell with you. It's out of Celtic spirituality.
Sure.
That thin places are either places to go, physical places to go, or just states of being where the kind of the veil between this world and the next is thin. So I think what you're saying about the Hudson Valley, I think might be, because I've been now cataloging both real places. I did one on nighttime as a thin place recently, but also I just direct people to places in the physical places where you can feel something different. Certainly the Seligmann graveyard, he and Arlette were buried on their property. He had to get special permission from the town of Chester to be buried there amongst the old farm family that used to own the place. And we had one of our recent shows there. It was with Jesse Bransford, who was the head of the NYU art department, and he camped out while he was installing his show. And he just swears he had experiences with Kurt throughout the 2 or 3 days he was camping there. And you walk into that cemetery and you definitely feel that it's a thin place. And there's one very large old ash tree that just sort of beckons you as you come through the little iron gates.
Because this is a good point when we're talking about the farm. I was going to ask if he was buried there. The farm, as far as I can tell, dates back to the early 1800s, so they bought it mid-20th century.
Right.
So it came with a 19th century farm graveyard up on the hill, because obviously the people who previously lived there before had died. And I wasn't sure what was going on there. That's really lovely that they actually got to use the kind of original cemetery on the farm to be buried in.
Mm-hmm.
And thus, I'm not surprised you will get artists encountering Kurt posthumously, given that's a really good way that's a good death, put it that way. All right, let's, I want to put the book in context or comparison with other, how to describe this. What fascinates me about this reread through, because I had a copy in the 90s ages ago I got when I was growing up in Australia. And It's in the intro. It mentions that it prefigures the work of someone like Mircea Eliade, with a broadly similar and I would argue more nuanced hypothesis that essentially the universe is magic, right? That's more or less you're reading what is a history book, but it's almost like reading the Foden book that tricks you into a philosophical position. But the other ones from the 60s, the work of say Dame Frances Yates and a sort of personal odd favorite of mine, Morning of the Magicians. Are you aware if they had read Mirror of Magic? Because I just look at Dame Frances Yates had the resources of the Warburg Institute, and in the case of Pauwels and Bergier, they encountered people in concentration camps and so on that sort of wove that French esoteric story into something that is certainly less accurate than Seligmann's work, but that's I think why I like it. It's this odd and meandering story. But if you kind of hold him up against someone like Dame Frances Yates or even Mircea Eliade, it's astounding. I don't know what other books you can kind of think of the mid-20th century, because he got there 15 years before they did, and they had the Warburg Institute and various universities.
Yeah, I think you're probably more versed in this than I. Eliade was important to me. His work came out, if I remember, about the same time Campbell's did.
Yeah, true.
So it almost evidences the fact that things, human intervention aside, things come in waves. That things are in the atmosphere to sort of be materialized or recognized. So I see Campbell's work and Seligmann's work as kind of, oh my gosh, what's this? Sensitized men sort of recognizing something. But I don't know, I don't know I don't know enough of the magic literature to have a very smart response to what you said.
Sure. Well, Dame Frances Yates did a lot of work on the Rosicrucians and the sort of Hermetic Enlightenment or Renaissance of Florence, funnily enough. And in many respects, her thesis has not held up, as far as I can tell, as well as Seligmann's, frankly, because there is a sort of overemphasis on the middle class and up literate experience of the rediscovery of the Neoplatonist and the Hermetic amongst essentially wealthy Italian men who are funded by bankers, right? So you get a very specific view of shall we say, the magic of Europe there. It's not that she's wrong, it's just that it's overemphasized, and somehow Seligmann gets what he calls, and it's fair enough, peasant magic correct. Like, as far as when I look at what the historical or academic research in the last 15 years into cunning folk and the experience of quote unquote folk magic in Europe, that information was not available when he wrote the books. And it was his analysis of the documents that he had that's landed on something pretty astounding. I'll give you an example. So, and this is, funnily enough, something that contemporary magical practitioners don't get. And there is a fundamental difference in the understanding of the devil as experienced by practitioners amongst the peasantry and the approach of, say, literate magicians that you find with grimoires. And that misunderstanding, funnily enough, has led to a lot of burned fingers today. But he wrote, and I've pulled a quote out this time too, and I haven't ever seen it put better than this, which is, the infernal powers are to be controlled craftily. They are like a horse aware of the horseman's timidity. They will try by every means to dismount him. Now, I have a bunch of magic friends, and they will say that is exactly why, well, that's exactly the experience of operating via the grimoires, that they will show up and attempt to lie to you, and the way it works with peasantry is very different and very out in landscape, and as far as I can tell, he's like the earliest person to have understood the difference of how that trickster element is engaged with on a class basis, and it's a remarkable achievement. I was floored, having not read it for a while, and now with the benefit of knowing a bit more about the academic interest over the last 15 years in magic. It's really, really interesting.
I do think it goes back to that artistic mentality that is not as competitive as the academic mentality. That he didn't think that he was going to be judged. He didn't think tenure was pending. I think it was a different world, and I think he felt very comfortable and very well grounded in that collection of books he had to just lay it out and to engage. I mean, it was a very democratic approach to this information.
You're right. He could swing for the fences more because he wasn't worried about his job, and I think that's why the book has held up so well.
Yeah.
So as we come to the end of this, what do you want people? What do you want people to know about Kurt Seligmann? And as a follow-up / related question, do you think either there's time, it is the time for him to return to prominence, or do you think that's happening? Do you think we're heading into an era where he can maybe get his contemporary dues?
I don't know if that would be important. I don't think he didn't seem, just from the letters I've read. We've also published a couple of zines. But how much time do we have left?
Oh, as much time as you want, to be honest. I'm more concerned about you.
We've published some of his lectures that he gave at the New School, unpublished lectures that we had, typewritten onion paper copies of, and with handwritten things, and some in red, some in black. And he was not a vain man. In that way. So it isn't like he wanted his due.
Yeah, you're right. I described that poorly. I think what I was trying to say is I think the world needs Seligmann rather than he needs us.
So I think he models the idea that we all carry that spark of life, that soul within us, and that the best you can do is learn how to listen to another person or be with another person rather than seeing each encounter as kind of a competition. Am I gonna best this person? So I think the range of his writing is to sort of allow for alternate models of human interaction. This is the way the Sumerians did it. This is the way, but they're all talking about the same kind of phenomenon, the way the Egyptians did it or the Gnostics. And that idea of honoring the fact that there may be many different ways to understand the same reality, that everything is not black and white. And one of my favorite quotes, and I think it's from, oh dear, it's so favorite, I forgot where it's from. I'll remember in a second. These things are not as they seem, nor are they otherwise.
Ah, it's so good.
The ability to hold that in your head first and then in your heart is a real challenge. And I think that he would agree with that the fact that all is all, that we can't know everything, and the best we can do is just take a longer view of what things are. And the way that happens, of course, is the way he was doing. There's some automatic activity. How do you silence that need for control at times, that need for order, and you being in charge? And it was, paying attention to dreams, which you cannot control your dreams. So you actively pay attention to them. You look at coincidence, you look at accident. Some of those surrealist games, and they're very easy to sort of find a list of what they are. Just from something as simple as find your surreal name. I don't know if you've done that, Gordon. Have you found your surreal name?
I have not.
Well, luckily for you, I've done it for you.
Hey!
That I took the letters of your name, Gordon Preston White, and what this game is, you use those letters as an anagram, and you then create for yourself or for another person, what other name could you go by? So Gordon Preston White became Pontier de Grunswith.
Oh, I like it. Hey, sounds fancier. I like it. I feel I should wear a pompadour hat or something.
So the idea of just allowing yourself into, I say silly, but there's probably a more clinical term that would be to allow yourself not as much logic and a little more out. You can be out of control without going crazy.
Yeah.
So the idea that you will I spent maybe 20 minutes coming up with variations on your name. Mine, I think, I did it years ago, and it's limna de kek. And the liminal is a very important term for me, constantly living in the borderlands. And I think that's what, also, Seligman's property is lovely. It's on the border of a train track, a swamp. I mean, there's a lot of miasma and fog in Seligman's farm property. And I think that if we learn not to fill in the wetlands and listen for the train whistle late at night, that kind of dreamy, almost haunting quality can really inform us. It's dreamlike activity.
That's fantastic. With the premium members a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about particularly when you're in that 30s Paris surrealist world, we have sort of lost what they meant by the word irrational. We think of irrational as a negative, but particularly in the French formulation of it, it is just as you described as it's like a serious silliness. It's a legitimate mode of being rather than a misbehavior or an unpredicted behavior. It's actually a deliberate exploration of another way of existing, which things like surrealist names come from. So I think it's high time we sort of francophoned or Frenched up that interpretation of irrational, because it's like a serious silliness, like what we were just talking about.
Yeah. Also, let me mention, the book is, as a physical object, it's really interesting, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
It's so big, it hurt my lap. I'm 6'2", 200 pounds, and this was a hard book to hold for very long. It has that wonderful red ribbon in it that you can use as a bookmark. So it just, as an object, and I was thinking of that, it makes itself known. So we're so used to the kind of sly, slippery cell phones, that are just silky and where's my phone? Where's my phone? This book you don't lose. I mean, it sits there and sort of growls on your desk to you. So just as an object, to balance off the kind of the slippery techno world, it's a wonderful thing to have. It's about a third, again, as big as the other ones you and I have, right? The older ones.
Sure. But it's a good point, because I think particularly in a sort of Seligmannian thesis, it has erupted from the unconscious at this point in time, and it announces itself in a large way. I think that about going back, say, 12 years, the appearance of Jung's Red Book after a hibernation of 70 years, yeah. Right? I think the existence of a book, that's why when it arrived and I looked at it, I'm like, I wonder, it's kind of what I was getting at. Does the world need Seligmann now, or is the world going to get Seligmann now? Because you see these things erupt like this remarkable, noticeable object as an example.
Mm-hmm. But if you see it in the kind of the history of kind of industrial design right now, I really like what the company did, what Inner Traditions did with it.
Yeah, me too. And I think it demonstrates a respect for the information that it deserves to be out in a form like this, which I can certainly agree with.
All right, finally, let me share one thing that came from one of his lectures at the New School, and this was on magic. Is that all right? Do we have time?
All the time in the world.
Great. So this is on one of those kind of home-typed things with hand corrections. And it was just a little bit, and he talks about how we all live in a kind of a helical, he doesn't use the word helical, but I do, helical mix of realities. And he says we live in three realities: the perceived reality, the imagined reality, and the remembered reality. And it's just stuck with me for the couple of years that I've been sort of sitting with it. I wondered if I went back and is this Platonic? Is it Neoplatonic? Where does such an idea come from? But it really identifies those three distinct threads that we all create our realities out of. And I think he was doing that, his kind of remembered reality of boyhood in Basel and the kind of the deep traditions of Europe, and the kind of imagined reality of the troubadours and the heraldic traditions, and then this perceived reality of, oh my God, World War I, World War II, and it puts you in a very unusual. I mean, if you triangulate all those things, it's a very kind of multifaceted and fresh way to look at the world. Especially for people who consider themselves rationalists or realists. That I only believe what I can measure. But if you begin to allow for the fact that something, for instance, is important as ancestral karma. That I'm sorry, Mr. White, you were born into this world with some tasks to do. Really? Yes, and you have to find out what they are. So the fact that everything is not measurable and knowable, I think that's one of his wonderful contributions to this whole discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that the center is publishing some of these lectures. Are they? Can we drop some of those in the show notes?
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, they're zines. We sell them for $15 each, and it's the full text, photographic text of his lectures that he gave at the New School in the 50s on different topics: space, magic. There's 4 at this point, and then plus kind of either commentary or artwork in response to it.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, they're lovely. I'll send you information on it.
Nice, and we'll drop that in the show notes. And for people, obviously, there will be a link to the book and some of the videos I just mentioned over the course of our discussion. But is there anywhere else you'd like people to go to find out more about yourself or the center or Mr. Seligmann, any of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think, as you were mentioning earlier, the Weinstein Gallery has done, their website is remarkable in terms of refreshing his reputation. And of course, because they want to sell his work, and they are the major kind of dealers of his work these days. So Weinstein Gallery, certainly in San Francisco. The Seligmann Center that I work at is a relatively modest place. I mean, it's kind of homegrown, and we have monthly meetings and activities there, poets, and we're having a masquerade next week. And so that I'll send you the information on that. And a lot of my interest in working with them for the last 10 years has just come out of my own background or my own interest in archetypal psychology, basically the work of James Hillman, who I just think is next to, God, in terms of his ability to take something and probe it and understand it. So archetypal psychology and surrealism, to me, and alchemy are all very entwined together. And that's, I think, Seligmann had an intuitive sense of Jungian psychology.
Well, so what you were talking about, simultaneous ideas sort of appearing into the world of men at the same time. What I love about the revelation of the Red Book is you kind of get an indication of what was going on kind of in the collective unconscious at the time that sort of maps to surrealist explorations. And I have a former guest, Dr. Becca Tanas, and she did her PhD on the parallels between Tolkien and Jung, essentially working on the same stuff and experiencing the same landscape. So this is, to the choir do you preach? I think Hillman is fantastic, as you say, but I love, that's what is so remarkable. And I think worth observing at this as this book announces itself towards the end of 2018, and you look at the wider world and what the book is and so on. I think there's something to it which we will no doubt live through.
Good. And then I have my work is kind of gone from being a furniture maker, making unusual natural form furniture, into basically spending time studying alchemy. And I have my website I have, and a material I'm working on, which is quite a bit online, is called The Casual Alchemist.
I like it. There's a weird parallel to Kurt's life there, isn't there? Sort of beginning in furniture and ending in alchemy.
Well, I hadn't thought of that. That's funny.
All right, maybe he's been visiting you from the graveyard as well.
That's funny.
Well, Daniel, all of this will be in the show notes, of course, and it's been a fantastic discussion. And yeah, thanks to yourselves at the Institute and Inner Traditions for kind of embarking on this project. I think it's a nice book to have in the world in such a nice format.
Good. It's been very pleasant talking with you, Gordon.
Why should you read The Mirror of Magic, then? Primarily, I would say because it belongs in the orbit of some of the other mid-20th century esoteric books we briefly touched on during the show. The works of Mircea Eliade, Dame Frances Yates, and of course Morning of the Magicians. It's part of our story in that sense. But also, having myself written a history book that is also a magical philosophy book, read it for that as well. How does a surrealist understand magic? Specifically, how does a surrealist with a profound understanding of history build a case for magic? What emerges can only be described as a post-Red Book publication Jungian flow model of history, albeit 70 years beforehand, which sounds clunky, but the premium members at least will get what I mean. And also, it's just so French, frankly, that the whole thing emerged in substantial part out of an argument over the first tarot trump, out of an argument over the Fool. And what would follow would be an unfurling parade of archetypes through Western history. There's a lot to think with right there alone. So check out some of the show notes for more about Seligmann and Daniel as well. And a big thanks to Inner Traditions for not only republishing the book in a way that it probably deserves, but also patiently finding me someone to talk to about it when I excitedly emailed them back. So, let's close out the show with a quotation from Seligmann about magic that I am quietly confident we can all get behind. A system that prevailed for thousands of years hardly needs an apology. Until next time.